listeners. Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Conversation with Carl. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. Today, I am honored to welcome Peter Norton, Professor of History in the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia, where he teaches history of technology, social dimensions of engineering, research, and professional ethics. He's the author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, and of Autonorama, The Illusionary Promise of High-Tech Driving. Welcome, Peter Norton, to the conversation.
Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to get started with, in your book, Fighting Traffic, you discussed the fact that due to various factors, most American cities were built for automobiles, not public transit. Why do you think so?
Well, I would back up and actually say most American cities were built for everything but driving because, of course, most of them are older than the automobile. But you're right. After that, not only did the old cities get rebuilt, readjusted to automobility, but also they expanded into new areas that were designed really only with drivers in mind. And the reason why that is actually very controversial. Some people will tell you, well, it's technological progress. Some people will say it's American culture. Americans just love their independence of movement, their privacy, and so on. They love the automobile. My own findings looking in the historical record is that it's a lot more interesting than that. And in fact, people welcomed the car, but they did not welcome car-dependent urban design, and they resisted it, and it had to be sold to them. And the reason they were pressured to accept it is the people who wanted to sell cars and roads were really intent on selling more cars and more roads, and so they preferred car-dependent urban design for that reason.
But a lot of us have been taught that it's easier to take a car, but sometimes you realize public transportation is much easier.
Well, and as your question implies, it depends on the circumstances. If you're in Manhattan on a weekday, it's probably going to be a lot easier to take the subway than to drive. But if you're in most of America, suburban America, even urban America, driving is probably going to be the easier choice if that's actually a choice you have. A lot of people don't own a car or for various reasons, medical or otherwise, can't drive a car. But in most of America, yeah, it makes sense to drive, and driving is more convenient, not because there's a law of nature that says that driving is more convenient, but because we laboriously and expensively rebuilt America for drivers at the expense of everyone else.
You talk about the shift to dominance of the automobile was deliberate and purposeful, as you're just saying right now, not an inevitability. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, I don't have to speculate. I can look in the actual historical record of the people who made the decisions that made this kind of urban form happen. And the really decisive era was exactly 100 years ago in the 90s. Because already the car was very popular in America by then. There were tens of millions of automobiles on the roads even 100 years ago. Most of them were Fords, but there were plenty of others for people who could afford to pay a little more. And yet the people selling cars at that time were having a lot of anxious meetings with each other. And I've read the transcripts of their meetings, and they're saying to each other very explicitly, look, fellas, it looks like everybody who wants a car has already bought one. All we're going to be able to sell to now is the replacement market. We'd like to sell cars to a lot more people, but people, especially in cities, are not buying cars. People who could afford a car in Chicago or Boston are not buying a car because they say they don't need one. So what we have to do, and I'm sort of simplifying a lot of historical documents. They're saying to each other, what we have to do is find a way to make driving the best way to get around even a city. And that's going to take some re-engineering of the physical city. It's also going to take some mental re-engineering to tell people not to walk in the streets. And also it's going to take some legal re-engineering in the sense that we're going to have to make cars a legal priority in streets. And so those were the three fronts of their attack: social norms, who belongs in the streets; laws, who has priority, legal priority in the streets; and engineering, how do we build to help people move around. And on all three of those fronts, they made sure, or they did their best to make sure that the automobile would come out on top.
So as a New Yorker, I would say New York City is an outlier in America when it comes to prioritizing pedestrians over cars. Why did New York City remain so pedestrian focused while the country shifted towards car-centric streets?
I agree with you that New York really is an outlier in the American context. I have a friend who's an expert who tells me that 60% of all transit trips in the USA are in metropolitan New York.
Wow, that's really high.
Yeah, I haven't confirmed that number, but that's what he mentioned to me. But it wouldn't surprise me because, the subway has no comparison anywhere else in the country, and it's amazingly convenient. Now, to get to your question, though, well, there is, of course, such a thing as New York culture. I mean, it's a complex of many cultures, but, New Yorkers are known to be assertive. That means the pedestrians are assertive. But also, I think even more important than that is that you've got a city in New York where people have to walk a lot. You can't drive door to door in New York. You can't even drive parking lot to parking lot in New York. You're going to have to walk, whether it's from the place where the taxi could drop you off, or from the subway station, or from the bus stop. You're going to have to do some walking in New York between destinations. And you got a lot of streets to cross. You've got on the city blocks in New York are on the street side. They're very short, such that if you're walking up or down one of the avenues, you're crossing the streets all the time.
As a
And
friend of mine says, in New York City, you go with the lights. Whenever you're walking anywhere, you
you
walk with
go
the lights.
And that advice makes a lot of sense because you can't afford to be a pedestrian in New York who's too deferential. Because the
Yeah.
minute you're showing that you're deferential, the driver's going to take it.
Yeah.
You got to be assertive. You've got to show that you're charging ahead. And there's an art to balancing that in such a way that you're assertive, but also you're not suicidal. And New Yorkers get a lot of training in this from an early age. And if you spend time in New York, you quickly develop this skill, which is really different from most of the USA, where you go to an average American suburb in the Midwest. People might be at a marked crosswalk and they're waiting till there's no cars in sight sometimes. And you just can't afford to do that as a pedestrian in New York. You have to be assertive.
Well, you can tell who's a tourist if they're looking up, if there's a movie set. No New Yorker is interested in a movie set. We're just walking right through it, and we
Right.
just want to keep going. If you're a tourist, you're looking up, you're
Yep.
walking through the set. You're like, who's shooting here today?
Yeah. And if you're an out of towner in New York, you're going to learn quickly to be assertive like the New Yorkers, or you just won't get anywhere.
The auto industry has tremendous influence in America. When did this influence start, and how did it manifest to shape America's reliance on automobiles?
That is such an important question because, of course, the automobile industry began long before it really started to organize in a way so as to advance its common interests. At first, there were dozens, if you count the really small companies, there were hundreds of automobile companies. They weren't necessarily talking to each other very much. Also, drivers were really, really well organized from an early era in the American Automobile Association and then other auto clubs, most of which were local affiliates of the American Automobile Association. There are also a couple of other automobile associations. And at first, they aren't really pushing driving on any non-drivers. They're just making sure that drivers aren't taxed too much, their fees aren't too high, and this sort of thing. What really changed their minds and what really got their attention and led them to conclude, hey, fellas, and they were basically all men, we have to get together and we have to make sure that drivers get priority. There was a reason for that, and that was that by about 1920, death toll from driving in American cities was just jaw-droppingly horrifying. And it was primarily not other drivers or car occupants. It was mostly people walking who were getting killed by cars because people were not used to people being able to drive around fast. They had grown up where it was safe to walk in the street. Among the people getting killed, about half of them were kids, especially in the bigger cities like New York. And so this meant there was some catastrophically bad public relations happening here. And now today, if a kid is killed in the street, people tend to ask, where was the parent? Where was the caregiver? Why was this child permitted out in the street? That was absolutely not the way people looked at it 100 years ago. 100 years ago, they thought, why is this motorist not making absolutely sure that he's not going to hit a child. In other words, the way people thought about who's responsible
Has
was,
changed.
yeah, it was changed, and it was definitely the driver's responsibility. And I mean, the law saw it that way, judges saw it that way, newspaper editors saw it that way, and most everyday people saw it that way. They thought the driver is responsible. So if you put that together and you realize you got this high death toll, the victims are not in cars, and everybody's blaming the driver, this was actually a big threat. That threat really came home in 1923 when 42,000 people in Cincinnati signed petitions saying, we want a law, and that law will say that you can't drive a car in Cincinnati unless it is a car that's been mechanically limited to 25 miles an hour maximum. And the people selling cars were like, that would be a disaster, because why do people buy cars? It's because the car goes faster than the street car. And if they put this law through, the car loses that advantage. And so they organized, they fought. That Cincinnati proposal was defeated at the polls, but it was defeated at the polls because local automobile interest groups, the dealers, the auto club, aligned with manufacturers, and they took out advertising and everything they could do to stop this thing. And yet, that one threat was only an example of hundreds of others like it throughout the country, including in New York, where there were proposals to ban what they called at the time pleasure cars in the south end of Manhattan. And those proposals really got the attention of the people selling cars and selling roads. And they organized. One of them said exactly what their goal was. This line is so amazing, it's now committed to memory. This guy said in 1922, the obvious solution lies only in a radical revision of our conception of what a city street is for. In other words, we have to redefine the street as a place for everybody, which is how they thought of it then, to a place just for driving, and they succeeded, which is why we think of the street as for driving today. And it's why we blame the pedestrian if they're out in the street away from a crosswalk instead of blaming the driver the way they did 100 years ago.
If you're looking at it, it could be it could be both people's fault, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you're looking
That's
at it both ways, and you
right.
can see like, well, why was the person running? What
Yeah.
happened? And you got to pay attention. I mean, like I know in the city right now, I find it very hard to drive around in New York City because of the cyclists.
Yeah.
And there's so many bicycles, there's so many food deliveries, and that is making it a little stressful.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how the city is changing. There was an anti-car era, and there are people that I will talk to and say, we don't need cars, we need to get rid of cars. I just don't see this as a serious argument. Could you give us some insight into this anti-car era and where we are with that today?
First, let me just say that I agree that it's not very helpful to phrase our dilemma as either getting rid of cars or letting cars dominate. There's a lot of other choices in between. We can find the places where cars make sense and favor them there. We can find the places where other things make sense and favor those things in those places. So we got a lot of choices, but you're absolutely right. Ever since there were, for the first time, millions of cars on the roads, which is over 100 years ago in the US, there have been people who have been anti-car. They have organized, like that Cincinnati movement to make cars incapable of going faster than 25 miles an hour within city limits. Those proposals have been around a long time. They've got a lot of good reasons behind them. We have a horrific death toll. It's on the order of, it varies, but in a typical year, 38,000 Americans are killed. Over 100 Americans a day die on the roads. We also have the incredible energy intensivity of cars. Even the electric cars have to be charged, and that takes electric power that has to be generated. And most of the electric power generated is generated by fossil fuels. We've got the expense of insuring, buying a car, getting it in compliance with all the rules, all the inspections, the approvals. We've got the fuel. The list goes on. There's a lot of reasons why it would be smart to have a country where you don't have to drive as much as most of us do. And that has a long history. And interestingly, the part that's least known is also the part that's most conspicuous in the historical record. We had many decades where the typical car-owning family in America was a one-car family. Usually the husband monopolized the car. Often the woman in the family didn't even have a driver's license. Most American women of driving age didn't have a driver's license until the 1960s. And those women were the leaders of the anti-car movement in America for many decades, especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when they organized protests and they would block streets illegally. They did this a lot in New York City, just make a string of people across the street, maybe sitting in lawn chairs or standing, often pushing a baby carriage. And these events were so common that reporters called them baby carriage blockades. They were illegal. They were like civil disobedience campaigns. Women of all classes participated in them. There were
That's fascinating. Why do you think so?
well, they were very clear about why. These women, mothers, were usually at home without a car. If they were outside of the city, as most of them were, they were kind of stranded because it was hard to get anywhere as America converted to car first transportation. They were often kind of isolated as a result. And also, these decades when these movements happened coincided with the baby boom. So they usually had multiple kids and they were trying to say, you better go outside and play. But the kids couldn't cross the street safely because by the middle of the 20th century, there's a lot of people driving fast. And so they had a very understandable interest in demanding some restrictions. They were not saying ban the car. Like you just said, they realized that was not a realistic goal. And probably a lot of them didn't even want to ban the car. But what they did demand were things they thought they could get, and they often did get them, things that would slow drivers down. The most common demand was just to put a stop sign up on my street so that drivers have to slow down. They didn't think of the stop sign the way traffic engineers do, as a way to make cars stop and look for other traffic. They thought of the stop sign simply as a way to slow people down so that their kids would have a chance to cross the street safely.
Where do driverless cars come in today? Because this is something that's talked about a lot. And you see in some cities are having driverless cars. Where are we on that?
That is a controversial question, but I've got some views that I'll be glad to share with you about that. So yes, we've had driverless cars on the road for over a decade now. At first, they were with what the companies called a safety driver, a person sitting in the car ready to take over. Often, though, so bored because the car wasn't doing anything wrong that they weren't ready when an emergency arose. And it's a bizarre kind of thing in a way, because these are by companies, and the companies, of course, are for-profit private companies, but they're all losing money on all of these rides, which sounds contradictory to what a for-profit company's goals are. Of course, what they're trying to do is last out, endure this period where it costs the money until they come out on top, and then can raise the fares and make it remunerative. And this is how they attract investors. This is where their real revenue stream has been coming from, not from the passengers. So we have in other words, a mobility system that is not cost effective. It's much more expensive to provide the service than you can charge people for. It's also got basically all of the disadvantages of ordinary cars. They take up a lot of space. They're expensive. In fact, these robotic cars are much more expensive than the cars most people own at home. They're also expensive to operate because you had to have remote supervisors who are at central control stations overseeing what's going on so that they can intervene if necessary. And also, they're not really capable of meeting most people's everyday transportation needs for the same reason that most of us can't afford to take a taxi or an Uber every day. So they're serving a low importance transportation service, relatively speaking, in cities. It's also a service we've been able to meet for over a century with automobile taxis driven by people. It's not even clear that the driverless taxis are going to cost less than human driven taxis. So they're kind of a bizarre thing. And I think they're best interpreted, as I see it, as an attempt to make car first transportation finally work through the application of technology. But I'm not optimistic that they really do have that effect. And they do cause some harm in the sense that they divert some people from public transportation. They're sometimes misunderstood by policymakers as an easy way to get the equivalent of public transport. And that can actually sort of sabotage public transport efforts. They can clog streets because, of course, people want to be dropped off at popular destinations. And then you can have crowds of Ubers or driverless robo taxis converging on these things. So they are problematic at best.
I've been in a driverless car where I've sat behind the wheel and you just sit there and let the car go.
Yeah.
And I am very nervous the whole time, and I don't like it. I like to take control of the wheel. I like to have control of the car, and I feel like sometimes when we're going and I feel like we should slow down a little bit, and the car just it has its mind of its own.
Yeah, and I think actually your misgivings are very rational because we are being told that these robo taxis are smart. They use this word a lot in tech, and they're smarter than people. And certainly they have some virtues that human beings are deficient in. They don't get impatient and so on. They don't check their phone while they're driving and so on. But at the same time, they don't have what human beings do have, which is incredible capacities at spatial motor reasoning. Human beings are breathtakingly good at navigating complex, busy environments. You know, you look at an athlete on a football field, you look at a driver on a busy street in Manhattan, the mental processing and the physical coordination required is breathtaking, and machines really aren't excellent yet at that kind of thing. And the companies like to say our robot cars are better than human drivers. But if you look at the actual traffic safety record of human beings, while it looks terrible because of the 40,000 people being killed a year, if you look at the risk per mile driven, human beings are actually very safe drivers. If we, separate the reckless high speed driving types, the typical human driver who's been on the roads for a few years is superbly good and will also get from A to B more efficiently with fewer false stops. And your trained intuition and experience makes you a better driver than any robo-taxi you'll be in,
Yeah.
provided you're a responsible driver.
When my daughter was learning to cross the street and she was younger, I would tell her, anticipate where the car is going. And
Yeah.
that's what you're talking about. You see the car there. Where do you think it's going to go?
In
And I
fact,
would,
Carl, you just put your finger on the toughest part for the robo-taxi companies is getting robo-taxis that can anticipate what's going to happen in the next 5 seconds.
Yeah.
Human beings are way better at that right now. And this explains some of the frustrations people have in robo-taxis because the robo-taxi doesn't know what's going to happen in 5 seconds, not to the degree that a human driver would.
And I ask this question to everybody right now because we're talking about AI everywhere. Where do you see AI playing a role in the future?
Yeah, so AI is already a part of the systems that make robo-taxis and other driverless vehicles work. This is problematic. I'm not the expert on this subject, but I listen to the people who are, people like Missy Cummings or Phil Koopman, among others, the real engineers and roboticists, and the ones who are not directly employed by the companies and therefore can speak with real independence. They are very cautious about relying on AI in driving environments. They're simply, AI is a prediction machine, and it's a prediction machine with certain well shown, well documented defects and the capacity to commit what the companies call hallucinations, but what everyday people would just call errors. And those errors, if you're using AI to write a term paper, those errors might get you a bad term paper. But if you have this AI governing decisions on the road, we have much more at stake in that situation. So clearly AI is here and here to stay and will continue to spread. But I think we as citizens have to be skeptical about the promises that are being made, especially in any applications of AI where safety is concerned.
And where do you see the future of transportation and
Well, I see a sort of list of possible futures. It's a little bit like the game shows where, you got different things behind door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3. Well, one of these doors that they're pointing out to us is a future of high-tech driving where maybe most of the cars are driving themselves. This is a future that could be super profitable. And because it could be super profitable, it's being heavily promoted. And yet I think of that future as very dangerous in the sense that it will it'll be extremely resource intensive. It will demand also a lot of payment from the people using the services because they have an inherent expense to them. It's a future of ever more technology. It's a future where it could be a sort of feedback loop of ever more sprawl as people sit in cars, can do whatever they want, and therefore don't mind going an extra hour because they can do some work while they're traveling. But if everybody's traveling 2 or 3 times more than they were before, the implications are very troubling. So that's a possible future. It's a future that's being promoted, and it's a future, I think, that we as citizens have to be skeptical about. I see other possible futures, and they're not that hard to imagine because we have versions of them now. If somebody goes to the Netherlands, they'll see a country where everybody can drive if they want to, but you usually don't have to drive. You don't have to drive every day because you got choices. The cities and suburbs there are walkable. Even the small towns have bus service. You can bike everywhere. There are towns in the Netherlands where more than half of trips involving a vehicle are on a bike. The city of Utrecht is such a town. They've got the bikes integrated with the public transport system such that if you get a train ticket, when you arrive at your train station, you can then pick up a public transport bike to get you to your final destination. When you're on those bikes, you're probably not causing the stress to drivers that you feel in New York because you're probably on a separate bike lane out of drivers' path. And even drivers in the Netherlands rate their driving experience very highly on the app Waze, where drivers evaluate their driving experience. The Netherlands gets very high ratings even for the driving experience. So that's a future where you drive when it makes sense to drive, and when it doesn't make sense to drive, you've got all the other options that you need. And I think we could learn from that example. People tell me, well, the Netherlands is a completely different country. And my reply to that is not really. The Netherlands is like two New Jerseys, and it's two New Jerseys in area. It's also got the same population density, the same median income levels, the same topography, and the same climate. So if the Netherlands can do it, New Jersey can do it. And if New Jersey can do it, America can do it.
Well, when you're looking at LA and you're looking at New York City, you're looking at different places.
Oh,
And if you're looking at Cincinnati or you're looking at Dallas, they're all different. So
yeah.
the problem is when one city can figure it out, the other cities are going to have to look to those cities to start
Yeah.
help to make the change.
Though even in settings like Los Angeles, this can be pursued in a piecemeal, step-by-step, incremental basis where, for example, LA's metro has been expanding recently. And where it expands, you have opportunities, and some of these opportunities have been taken for some local development, not citywide development, but local development that's more walkable, bikeable, and transit friendly, such that people have some choices that they didn't have before. So even in LA, we can see incremental, modest improvements that are realistic.
And as we wrap up, is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
Well, given this subject matter, I could go on with you for days. If I had to just limit it to one more observation, I would say, this is a country that welcomed the car, but it has always resisted environments where driving was the only option. And we have a long history of advocacy for choices. We're a country that celebrates freedom of choice. And I'd like to see a future where we can see that value represented in our transportation system, where choices could include driving, but they would also include comfortable biking. Even for people who don't feel safe biking in traffic, there would be separate lanes for them. And where we have good public transportation as well. That's a city everyone can love.
Peter Norton, professor of history in the Department of Engineering and Society at the University of Virginia, also the author of Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, and Autonorama, The Illusionary Promise of High-Tech Driving. You can get those books where you get your books. Also out there, thank you so much for listening to me today. Let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comment section. And as I always say, until next time, be safe, everyone.